nips and curls and nuts and seeds and dates and weeds and plants and bats and bees and bugs and voles and rats and moles and squirrels and Democrats and pretty girls and lemon scones and boats and bones and Buddhist quotes and pheromones and stones and oats and scribbled notes and scrapes and nicks and magic tricks and twigs and sticks and politics and talks and ticks and clocks and maps and schnapps and caps and keystone cops and dental floss and tartar sauce and moss and moose and lemon juice and self-abuse and nursery rhymes and mother goose and father time and aunt abuse and coffee grounds and licks and stamps and circus clowns and stomach cramps and sweat and blood and sand and mud and dust and dirt and belt and shoes and hats and shirts and pants and keys and locks and cheese and cracker jacks and books and snacks and kings and dukes and paradise and rice and beans and bad advice and hopes and dreams and worn out jeans and northern lights and edelweiss and ice and moons and red balloons and cups and spoons and afternoons and tunes and drums and toes and thumbs and bluegrass bands and cracker crumbs and hearts and lungs and spleens and tongues and heels and hands and eyes and ears and beers and bars with sticky floors and walls and halls and steps and doors and works and plays and hollandaise and bolognese and holidays and yangs and yings and hugs and grins and nods and shrugs and jugs of gin and rums and cokes and onion dips and artichokes and moistened lips and coats and boots and muffs and mitts and olive pits and fits and starts and arts and crafts and days and years and figs and grapes and prunes and pears and sneers and stares and grins and winks and blinks and frowns and grams and pounds and tons and sums and twos and ones and yous and yours and us and thems and hers and his and nows and thens and downs and ins and ups and outs and mares and oats and does and goats and knits and wools and tweeds and twills and chintz and knits and silks and frills and fleece and felts and furs and phones and necks and heads and hairs and combs and plates and drains and bowls and grains and veins and knees and nerves and brains and points and curves and arcs and planes and cones and lumber, sparks and flames and logs and timber, stumps and leaves and frogs and flies and thieves and lies and whens and wheres and whos and whys and lines and hooks and nets and poles and mounds and pits and piles and holes and bolts and nails and screws and nuts and hopes and fears and woes and guts and cuts and blades and swords and pens and tribes and clans and folks and friends and tiffs and spats and breaks and mends and hugs and sex and pecks and gifts and notes and totes and bins and bags and ads and shouts and flags and greens and reds and tints and hues and rolls and rocks and jazz and blues and horns and harps and riffs and sharps and flats and bends and fifths and thirds and words and rhymes and scales and tones and groans and snorts and grunts and sighs and sniffs and snores and cries and slurps and burps and barks and peeps and chirps and tweets and cleans and scrubs and sweeps and steams and steeps and stews and fries and tarts and treats and cakes and pies and streams and creeks and lakes and peaks and streams and dreams and wakes and eats and crawls and walks and lays and rise and stands and falls and prays and dies and wails and weeps and drips and noses, earns and worms, raindrops on roses, moans and hums and bangs and snaps and drones and clicks and rings and claps and comes and goes and fades and grows and dims and wanes and ebbs and flows and everything we think and know, and yet we gotta let it go and bends and twists and limbs and wrists and kicks and fists and fights and frees and bites and wings and flights and bees and stings and traps and snares and nets and bleeds and sweats and gives and takes and stirs and shakes and is and was and stays and does and said and did and bids and bets and curse and jinks and drowns and floats and swims and sinks and founds and seeks and stops and thinks and highs and lows and tries and fails and thighs and calves and ties and tails and suits and heels and halves and knots and needs and funds and deeds and loans and bonds and banks and buys and owns and deals and sells and crowds and noise and cheers and waves and clouds and toys and spheres and balls and paves and digs and sprains and aches and bleeds and breaks and strains and hurts and hits and shakes and salts and spice and soaks and ice and schmaltz and yolks and slice and dice and cleats and booms and cheats and peels and crabs and seals and clams and eels and fins and gills and whales and prawns and rooks and pawns and knights and kings and knots and strings and news and facts and reads and views and sees and acts and wins and lose and please and thanks and beans foods and franks and guns and blanks and wounds and nurse and graves and hearse and tunes and caves and hymns and verse and grieves and faints and heaves and mourns and gods and saints and crowns and thorns and rods and staff and golden calf and horns and hooves and kneels and